Thank you, everyone, and thanks for the organisers for inviting me and asking me to speak today. I'd like to first to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land that we're standing on here today and meeting at. Thank you, Uncle, for your lovely acknowledgement. I'd like to acknowledge the elders, both past and present, and I'd like to extend that acknowledgement and respect to everyone else here present today. I suppose to start the talk about how I've come to my thoughts about food security and how that affects my work today, it's probably to go back to the beginning and hear my story, and a story that's probably common to a lot of Aboriginal people. My family is originally from Roma in Queensland, Surat on the Condamine. And I suppose food security, the word to me, I probably only became familiar about a year and a half ago what that term was. And when I started looking at it, I realised that I've really experienced, and been very conscious of food security all my life, and the lives of my father, my grandparents and my great-grandparents. I believe food security within Aboriginal communities existed, and they managed it quite well prior to colonisation and the determining of terra nullius of this country. My people lived off the land. They lived, I take my grandmother's people, which my mother is not Aboriginal, but I grew up with my father and for most of my life, and I still call Roma home, even though I was born in Sydney and Redfern. Roma is very dear to my heart. It's where some of my uncles still fish and live off the river there. They were moved from their traditional lands and they were placed on reserves along the river. Initially, those lands were quite large, and over time, with graziers and the sheep industry, those lands got reduced. Earlier, I heard that there was no slavery in Australia, and I dispute that. There actually was. Aboriginal people were rounded up and herded like cattle onto missions or reserves. They were forced to work, to live, to survive, to eat. The government, we're the most politicised people since, European colonisation. We've had to live under government restrictions, rations and handouts since that day. There have been times where a lot of times where our people fought and rallied against those policies, and they did learn how to cultivate the land. They supplemented the rations and the dietary intake from their local knowledge. I can still remember, going back home, living off echidna, goanna, rue, and it's still, I can still remember my father, his mouth watering when, it was actually here he was offered some echidna to eat, and I didn't realise how much, he missed his traditional foods. So my life and the life of my grandparents and my great-grandparents was quite hard. They lived through some very tough times, and with that, when everything that you've known gets destroyed and taken away and removed, it actually creates quite a lot of emotional trauma and lots of grief and loss issues. My grandfather committed suicide before I was born. my great-grandmother, her husband died. She married a non-Aboriginal man, so she was then excluded from the Aborigines Protection Policy. She was then able to work from different stations and take her children around, and that's how she lived. So she gained some of that economic independence, but it was also very hard. They lived during the wars, and I found actually about 20 years ago, I found some war food stamps. There was a whole book my grandmother still had, and I asked her why she didn't use them, and she said, "You never know when you'll need them again." And so they always, people will say about Aboriginal people, there's not a lot of planning or thought for it, but it's actually about that hoarding and how we keep everything that's really determined how I think I've lived my life and how I've shown my children how to live. We grew up in Redfern. Times were tough. My father moved down. He met my mother in Sydney. When he came down looking for work, a lot of people did back in the early 60s, late 50s. He then travelled back to Roma, took his new wife, and they had some children and come back, and she left. My dad found me one day in the house where my brother was trying to give me an empty bottle. My father, he struggled a lot, and my grandmother came down. They moved from Roma, they came to live in Sydney and to help my dad out. So it was my brother and I and all my extended cousins. They had lived through a lot of stuff, and the reason why I'm homing in on this trauma, because we've heard a lot today about, if we can get kids to school, if we can get them completing year 12, that will, make a huge difference. I'm saying if we can even get to school is the biggest, achievement for us at this stage. We still have extremely high statistics with non-completion and low retention rates with Aboriginal kids. And part of that is around, we have very large families generally, Aboriginal people, and even if your immediate family is smaller, you have extended families. So living in Redfern, I have amazing memories, but life was hard. I can remember, and I still know those feelings of hunger, but I also know when food was plentiful. So my father was one of, a lot of people worked at, Francis Chocolates back then. So it was, we always knew we got an Easter egg, so that was something. The chocolate factory was right across the road from where I lived. And we were all poor, everyone who lived there, And I can remember not having lunch, going to school, not having lunch. I can remember when the first Aboriginal preschool, Marawina, was set up, and that started out as a breakfast club. So a lot of the people who moved to the city, that is what you did, like amongst Aboriginal communities, you helped each other out. So some of the aunties noticed that kids were going to school hungry, and they knew back then the way to get out of poverty was to get a good education. To get a good education, you needed to have a full tummy. So everyone donated, and it was the bucket brigade back then. They put in, and Mum Shaw, she worked very hard to feed us kids and get us to school, and everyone knew everyone. We were then, in the 1970s, there was a big push to get a lot of people out of the city and rehoused into the suburbs. A lot of Aboriginal people were moved from the bush, from Redfern, and rehoused. My grandmother got a house at Mount Druitt, and we got a house at Aids in Campbelltown. Some of my cousins lived at Liverpool, and so we were all spread out amongst, high density housing population. It wasn't until many years later, when I was sitting in a university course, that I realised that we were an experiment, ads. And I didn't realise, we were part of that. But we were all mixed in together. There was a great sense of community, but there was also a lot of struggling. You didn't go to welfare agencies. You sort of asked your neighbour for that cup of sugar. I still remember that. And I can remember once we were so shocked when someone asked for a bag of potatoes. But food was something that my father, it's probably the poverty and the amount of hunger that he experienced, I hadn't experienced, but I knew about it. His stories that he told and shared about having to go through garbage bins, not being employed, looking for work and living from garbage bins are stories I still tell to my children. Food is such an integral part of our lives. It's quite shameful in our community if you don't have enough to feed people who come over. So I was taught, to make something from nothing. And, that was my job from a very young age, to cook for my family. So that was something that I had to do so my parents could go out to work, so we had a place to live. What I think happens, and I've seen with my own family, is generational slippage. Each generation tries to make the next generation better for their children. And what I have seen, what I have done, is actually, I can remember when I was younger, there never being any, soft drink or cordial on the table. It was always water and a cup of tea. So when I could and I got a job, I bought that Coke. I bought that soft drink. And I made sure every night on the table my kids would have that, because I thought that was their right. It was only over time that I realised that wasn't the right way. It wasn't, And my dad, he taught us how to eat healthily, but he also taught us how to store and to stock up. And I can remember eating many Johnny cakes, damper, dipping it in the soup, and hearing, clog them kids up, feed them well. And that's what we've done. With that flour, those foods, we have clogged our arteries. My dad used to, because he was the only one in the family with a job, he used to go to the markets at Flemington. I used to accompany him, sometimes my brothers, and we would load up. He would buy in bulk because he said that was always cheaper, and I've never forgotten it. Always buy more because it's cheaper. And so we would then deliver it to all my aunties and cousins and that in the Mount Druitt area. So that's what we had to do. And food was so huge in our family. Everyone had to have it. Wherever you went, if there was someone coming over, you had to put on the biggest spread. And I can remember watching, my grandmother cook damper in the fire and sitting there eating it, and sometimes that's all we had. And my kids, they still roll their eyes at this story all the time. And it's around, I see when I put corn on their plate, and now they've, got probably about 5 other vegetables as well. And I say, do you know, corn used to be sometimes the only feed we would have. That would be our dinner. And they go, well, we know, Mum. And I say, but, and I said, no, but it actually filled us up. We liked it, and I'm looking at the size of the plate. When I was talking to people about coming to do this talk today, I was talking to other Aboriginal people, talking about food security, and, it was like this new concept, we're having this yarn about it, and someone, as we were telling the stories about growing up, someone said to me, what about how, you cooked for a big mob? And I said, yeah, we always cooked for a big mob. And she said, but now I can't. I can't stop myself from cooking for, 15 and 16 people to cooking for 4. And I realised that's what we do at home. And even to the point where there's that many leftovers, we got a dog so we could feed the dog the leftovers. And so we then, and now we don't have any dogs or pets, and the food gets wasted, and I can't handle that waste. So I'll try and see what I can do with the food and take it around to people. But all of that has looked at, I look at, how I've approached food and how, food has become one of my sort of comfort things. It's something that I taught my family, that to make you feel better, you had to have a full belly or an over full belly. And that's how I was living. And that's how I started realising I was making my family fat. I was making my kids fat. I looked at all the chips and lollies and, those foods where, I had to just chuck them in their lunchbox because I was a working mother. I had to have those fast, convenient foods that I could just chuck in, and at least they had something where no one would think they were shamed if they didn't have a feed. So I, over the years, like when I first started work, I had money for the first time in my life, and part of that I had to pay a lot of my family bills because my father had to give up work at that time and my mother had left again. So my comfort food was to go and buy takeaway, because we didn't have takeaway, when we were children. I can remember when the first McDonald's was built in Campbelltown, and I used to pray. I used to pray my father would take me to Macca's. And he never did. And if we were ever lucky to have takeaway, it would have been hot chips, Devon, on bread. And that if you ask a lot of Aboriginal families, Devon and tomato sauce and chips was, a good feed. Because if, you had mob turn up or there was a funeral and people come down or you had to go down, chips, bread and Devon spread so far. My husband is one of 16 children. He lived in a 3-bedroom house in Granville. He comes from Kempsey. He grew up on the mission, and he was subjected and his family to government handouts and rations, and then he and his family struggled a lot. So our food experiences are different but similar. I'm one of 8 children, and we grew up in a 4-bedroom house, and we often had my cousins or grandmothers or aunties living with us. So I now look, my children, my oldest child is 20 and my youngest is 12, and they have no grandparents. They've all passed away. My husband had 4 sets of parents because he was given to his aunt and uncle, at the time when all his brothers and sisters were removed. So they are all passed away. There's no one to hand down that knowledge and those parenting skills. That is where we get that, where we stop this, where all that knowledge, the time to sit down. We live very fast-paced lives now where to hear those stories and yarns are a luxury. I first started work in the Commonwealth Employment Service. I was lucky, It was the time in the 80s when there was a massive push on identity and getting Aboriginal kids into school. So we were targeted. We were placed in an Aboriginal roll call class, and we thought that was great because at least we would, get some things that were special for us. I had 2 people come to our school and they said that, you can get a job as a trainee, what do you want to do? And I used to say the standard, I knew all I wanted to do was to get out of this place. I didn't want to be for the rest of my life in AIDS. And I just used to say my standard, I want to be a psychologist. So they used to, I wanted to know why I was like the way I was, why my family was. So they took me, 5 minutes, God, I can rave. Okay, so they took me to, I'll cut it short now. They took me I got my first job at the Commonwealth Employment Service. I then did a traineeship, probably what's equivalent to a traineeship. I applied for a scholarship and I won a scholarship to go to uni to do psychology, and I realised I hated it. I hated being there with people I thought didn't know what life was really about, and that was really unfair of me. I was comparing my life to theirs. Then I was in some pretty turbulent relationships. So I left there, I took a redundancy from work and, wallowed in a bit of self-pity, I think, for a few months, or living it up. And then I moved into juvenile justice. And it was working in juvenile justice that I discovered the most about myself and my family. I was working with people who were my own family, were coming in, and through all the therapeutic programs and that I was being trained in to help the young people, it was actually helping me. I discovered so much about myself, my family, that awareness, that self-actualisation that made me realise that things have to change. I discovered later in life that, I'd hit rock bottom before I realised that I needed to make some changes. And then that path led me to working at Tharawal Aboriginal Corporation. Tharawal Aboriginal Corporation is an Aboriginal medical service that is more than just those areas of medicine. It's a holistic approach to health. You have your childcare centres, your early learning centres, your preschools. You have the Brighter Futures program where we teach parents about parenting skills that we might have lost. We have the Bringing Them Home program that looks at transgenerational trauma and the effects on families and how that has impacted. We have a healthy lifestyle team and Sophia who works there, she's our healthy lifestyle worker. She's also a dietitian with a nutritionist background who will be talking tomorrow about some of those programs in depth. But when I first went there, it was like every program was operating individually. The connection wasn't there. So I started looking at why, and a lot of it was the funding that we received. A lot of the Aboriginal workers were paid at a lower level. The government did not give us money to train and upskill and employ Aboriginal people at that qualified level. So we started looking at getting those skills up, getting people trained, giving them that right to be able to choose and determine how the program should work. We then talked to each other and we decided that we would concentrate first on developing internal referral pathways to programs. So if you've got, hepatitis C, it's a natural thing that we will refer you to our Good Tucker program where you're guaranteed fresh fruit and vegetables. You'll also be getting your clinical needs met as well. The Brighter Futures program, every parent there is referred to our Good Tucker program, our exercise programs, and then they can attend Community Kitchen. Can I just finish on this one? I just wanted to say one of the biggest things, we started off Community Kitchen and now we've got we had Community Garden from then. And we know that to make changes we need to be self-sufficient. But we can't do that without government funding. How do you do that if you don't have government funding? We can make parts of the program much better, but we can't do it without assistance from the government. The government helped create this problem and it needs to help fix it. So I agree with everything that's been said here today. Thank you.